Move into step 4. It's always kind of fun, isn't it, to finish one thing and begin anew? At least it is for me. So it's kind of fun to move into step 4. And of course, step 4, as you know, you contemplated this on one day, but I'm going to go ahead and read it to you again, page 130 in my version. If you have a different version, it might be a different page number. But step 4 is increase your desire for liberation. Make your desire for liberation more intense than the energy of 1 trillion stars. Make your desire for liberation so intense that your entire life is dedicated to awakening. The desire for liberation is the desire to bring the imposter self to its final end. And we could call that the self-centered ego, right? The desire to remain eternally as the true self that is infinite, eternal, awareness, love, bliss, free of all types of suffering. That sounds a lot like the article I wrote today. The desire to awaken from the human dream. The desire to live eternally in the direct experience of the absolute self that has never known falsehood, suffering, or illusion, and that has never changed in all eternity. And the desire to be forever free from the false and live eternally in the true. So what I thought I would do, I brought the most direct means to eternal bliss with me tonight. And I thought I would read to you some of my favorite sentences from chapter 4. Chapter 4 is the desire for liberation. So since we're starting step 4, I thought it would be fun to read some of my favorite sentences from chapter 4. And I have the green cover, but my favorite one is the black cover, which has the sentences numbered. I really, really like that. So I'll read the sentence numbers if any of you have this, but all of these sentences are also in the green cover, but they're just not numbered. Sentence number 1, awakening the extremely intense desire for liberation is the most important first step that can be taken towards being liberated now in this lifetime. And now I'm skipping to sentence 16. As your desire for freedom grows in intensity, the ego creates fewer obstacles. Number 17. When your desire for freedom becomes very intense, your desire for freedom demands that you take no detours. Sentence 18. When your desire for freedom becomes extremely intense, for the first time, you can see what is essential for freedom and what is not essential. Number 20. When the desire for freedom is stronger, you can begin to see the ego's preservation strategies. Number 21, and this is apparently a fairly favorite. You can always tell my favorites. In fact, Michael Langford talks about this. You know, some are underlined, some are circled, some are highlighted, but some are circled, underlined, and highlighted, and they might even have a star by them. So that means I really like this sentence, you know. So here we go, number 21. When the desire for freedom becomes even stronger, the desire for freedom itself will bring you everything you need to succeed in your quest for liberation, including the answer to all your questions, the direct path teachings, the solution to all obstacles, the motivation to practice, etc. I just love that sentence, right? Your desire for freedom calls everything you need to you. Like there can be no lack. Nothing lost. Let me read this sentence again since it's one of my favorites. When the desire for freedom becomes even stronger, the desire for freedom itself He'll bring you everything you need to succeed in your quest for liberation, including the answer to all your questions, the direct path teachings, the solution to all obstacles, the motivation to practice, etc. Number 23, when the desire for freedom becomes even more intense, you can see all of the ego's preservation strategies. Number 24, when the extremely intense desire for liberation is awakened, not weakened. When the extremely intense desire for liberation is awakened, you will marvel at how it was possible you did not see the ego's preservation strategies before. Okay, now I just got to show you this. The next three sentences I must really like because they're circled, they're underlined, they're highlighted, they have a star, and the word thank you is written next to them. So these are really favorites. 30. When the desire for freedom becomes even more intense, the ego will no longer create ego preservation strategies. Number 31, the extremely intense desire for the direct experience of the absolute truth will guide you to your inner teacher. Number 32, the extremely intense desire for truth will guide you to the practice that gives you the direct experience of eternal life. Those three sentences are maybe my favorites. Number 33, the key is the intensity of the desire for the direct experience of absolute truth. Number 34, increasing your desire for the truth is the most important first step. Number 35, increasing your desire for freedom is essential. I'm skipping over to number 51. When your desire for liberation increases greatly, every moment of your life will be dedicated to your liberation. Number 54, before the extremely intense desire for freedom arises, you think you can see, but you are really blind. Number 55, after the extremely intense desire for freedom arises, all is made clear and you have no doubts. Number 56, after the extremely intense desire for freedom arises, for the first time, you can see. And then I'm skipping all the way over to 130. The only problem an aspirant ever has is a desire for liberation that is too weak. An extremely intense desire for liberation will solve all other problems. So those are my favorite sentences from chapter 4 of the most direct means to eternal bliss. Does anybody have anything they would like to share or any favorite sentences you would like to share? All right, then let's move back to the 7 steps to awakening, and we are going to quote 789. The mind, which has obtained a burning desire for self-attention, which is self-inquiry, is said to be the fully mature one. And the reason I wanted to look at this particular quote is because it says self-attention is self-inquiry. So what does that mean? That self-attention is self-inquiry. Okay, Jay?
It just means that your attention is turned within. Um, I know that sounds simple, but I think it is all about where our attention actually is at any given time. Because our attention, our little spotlight that we have, and the ability to choose where we want to place it, um, within, I think is our willingness. So the fact that we are, let's say, do I want to take time for meditation, or do I think I have other things to do that are more important? That's another way of saying, where do I want to place my attention? And just the fact that we want to turn it within to inquire and look is a spiritual action, I think, of itself. So that's my thought.
Thank you very much, Jay. I know Cheryl wrote, being inquisitive regarding where we cast our attention. We did a retreat house survey recently, and the class that people most said they wanted to see at the retreat house, or the retreat that people most want to see at the retreat house in 2020, is the self-inquiry retreat, which I did offer twice last year. We offered it once in January and once in June, and we had a full house both times, even in January. Attention focused inward instead of outward, Ron says. So the self-inquiry, I think, the self-inquiry is looking to see what I am rather than looking to see what the world is or what's going on out there, right? So self-attention and self-inquiry are actually the same thing. And I remember reading in one of the books about Ramana Maharshi, one of his devotees wrote it. But in one of the books about Ramana Maharshi, he talks about how many people around Ramana Maharshi would do self-inquiry wrong. And what they would do is they would just sit there, I think probably with their eyes closed, and just repeat over and over again, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Like it was a mantra or something. And he points out that that's not what self-inquiry is. In fact, you really eventually don't even have to ask the mental question, who am I anymore, or what am I, even though that's very, very helpful in the beginning. What self-inquiry really is turning the attention around to look and find the answer. Right? It's not the words. It's the turning of attention. So that's why this says self-attention is self-inquiry. It could also say self-inquiry is self-attention, because it's putting attention on the true self in order to get to know it. I love how Michael Langford writes in the Loving Consciousness book, How to Live a Life That Knows Only Love, which again is no longer published. But I love how he writes about loving consciousness is like falling in love with a person. Right? I didn't bring that book up here, or I would read those lines to you. But, he talks about how at first you don't know them, but you want to get to know them, so you pay attention to them. You don't really have any expectations, but you don't know them, and you keep watching them. It's kind of funny because I have met Michael Langford, and I know Michael Langford a little bit on what you might call a personal level. I've seen even pictures of Michael Langford when he was like 17. And whenever I read those instructions, I kind of see Michael Langford sitting there looking at some woman, just, looking at the woman, watching her, getting to know her, paying attention to her, falling in love with her. I can see him. I can even see his grin, But I love that symbol that shows up in my mind when I read that, because the way that I see this 17-year-old Michael Langford, looking at a woman and getting to know her, I take that same attention and I turn that around to awareness, right? I just turn that around to awareness, just like 17-year-old Michael was with a woman. I turn that around and I give that attention to consciousness, to awareness, right? Self-attention. self-inquiry, wanting to get to know it, like you might want to get to know a person that you're attracted to. In fact, some notes that I wrote here underneath quote 789, where it says self-attention, which is self-inquiry. One note that I wrote is attention is love. And if you've never contemplated that before, if you just think about it for a few moments, you'll know it's true. If I told you, I love you, but I never gave you any attention at all, when we happened to be together, if you were talking, you could tell that I was totally distracted, not paying any attention to what you were saying, et cetera, would you feel loved? No. But if when I happen to be around you, if I do give you attention, if I do listen to you, if I show interest in you, do you feel loved? Yeah. So attention is love. And this is why, most experts on children will say what your children really want from you is your attention. See, children inherently know that attention is love. Right? So what your children really want from you is attention. So loving consciousness or loving awareness is giving attention to consciousness or to awareness, because that is love. Another note that I wrote down here, somebody else, Jay, has already said, so I'll just reiterate it, that practicing self-inquiry directs your attention. Or you can even say it directs your love based on what we just said. But when you say, what am I, or who am I, and you look to see, that question is directing your attention. And then the other thing I wrote down is an example of self-inquiry that I practice when I'm not in meditation, primarily. I mean, it can happen in meditation, but I practice it primarily not in meditation. When I find myself lost in thought, my mind went into thought and I was lost in thought, the inquiry that I ask is, what sees lost in thought? What sees lost in thought? And what I turn my attention to is, there was attention lost in thought, but something noticed that. Something more general than attention, because attention was lost. It wasn't noticing it. It was lost. And I turn my attention to what noticed lost in thought. That's an example of self-inquiry. And the reason I bring that up is I know that probably most of you, if not all of you, still find yourselves lost in thought during the day at certain times. So I wanted to bring up that practice instead of just like, oh no, I'm lost in thought, I'm not supposed to be, or whatever happens. Start looking, how did you know you were lost in thought? What saw that? What was aware of that? Right? That's a type of self-inquiry you can practice probably several times throughout the day. And it directs the attention then towards the true self, towards the awareness. Any comments before I move on? Or questions? Yes, Ron.
Yeah, I was listening to Helen Avery's last recording, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, and it touched upon this, and she was reading some of Gina Lake, which I'm not that familiar with Gina Lake. I've heard the name, but never really read any of her. And the focus of what she was talking about, instead of using the word awareness, she uses the word noticing, all the time. And her premise but it comes from just a little different direction. It's what we do, what we are is we notice. I mean, that's what we do as human beings. We notice, or you could say we are aware. I mean, you could use, awareness to me, although I've gotten a little more comfortable with it, it's still kind of a little bit of a foreign word, maybe an Eastern word a little bit, doesn't resonate. Now noticing, okay, that's a good old American word. I can get that. I can get a hold of that. It's kind of like, so what is it that notices that I was in thought, that I got lost in thought? It's exactly the same thing. It's just, it's awareness. It's who we are.
Yes.
And I thought that was an interesting twist. And obviously, as we notice, hopefully at this point, for many of us, we're being a little more objective and not trying to be judgmental of what we notice, more so than that we were just, our attention zoomed in to that thought, and our noticing is that zooming out. And can we just stay in that presence of noticing, that space of just noticing?
Yes. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, noticing. And noticing, we're noticing. Silly sentence. When you write those kind of sentences in, if you write those kind of sentences like on our website, you get a red mark for poor grammar. Our website actually gives red, yellow, and green marks when we write posts. If you say noticing that you're noticing, you'll get a red mark. But you guys know what I mean, right? Noticing that you're noticing. Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else want to share before I move on? All right, then the next quote I have us going to is 790. Since this mind, which has very well understood that the consciousness which shines as I alone is the source of full and real happiness, now seeks self because of its natural craving for happiness, this intense desire to attend to self is indeed the highest form of devotion. But the reason I wanted to look at this quote is I thought we might contemplate the mind's desire to awaken when we are also very, very well aware of the teaching that the mind itself doesn't awaken. Right? And, I don't want to go any further. I want you guys to share what meaning you find in that paradox. This quote is talking about the mind's desire to awaken. Let me read it again. Since this mind, which has very well understood that the consciousness which shines as I alone is the source of full and real happiness, now seeks self because of its natural craving for happiness, this intense desire to attend to self is indeed the highest form of devotion. So again, we're contemplating the mind's desire to awaken alongside the teaching that the mind can't awaken. Let me know what you come up with. Tony, you sharing? So you're still muted.
Okay, I just unmuted myself. For some reason, I feel like it might be saying something along the lines that using the thorn to remove the thorn. But what I wrote is a very short paragraph or sentence. What seeks self? When consciousness knows I am, it naturally desires to know its source. Desire provides the devotional attention to seek its love. So I'm not sure if this is what you're asking, but that's what came to me as I was contemplating that particular quote.
Thank you. That was very beautiful. I felt that in my heart as you read that. Thank you. Well, I'll tell you the image that came to me it was the image of a moth attracted to the light of a flame, right? The moth can't help but be attracted to the flame, but then what happens when it gets close enough to the flame? The flame burns it up, right? And I think it's something like that. The mind is what seeks awakening, right? And, and the true self is the flame. And so as the mind seeks awakening, it gets closer and closer and closer to the flame. And then when it gets close enough, the flame naturally burns up the mind. And I guess the reason I want to bring this up is because, a lot of the quotes, seem to talk about how, of course, they're talking about how the mind needs to be destroyed and all this other kind of stuff. And I think it can kind of give the mind a bad rep. And to some degree, the mind deserves a bad rep. Don't get me wrong. But the mind is also the tool that we use to awaken. When you have the intense desire for liberation, it's the mind that has that intense desire for liberation. That's what makes the moth fly to the flame. Yes, George?
I love that. I love that analogy. I mean, that's very visual. And I agree with you. I think we have split personalities or split minds, okay? And there is that part of the mind that is strictly ego, which overshadows the mind of spirit, that connection with spirit. But spirit's still there. I had a friend that had his wife had multiple personalities, and she had like several different personalities. I mean, like 5 or 6. And she described it, according to him, as they had kind of like a secretary, and there was only one personality at a time would go forth and interact. But the other personalities were back there watching. So anyway, I love that analogy of the moth to the flame.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone else want to share? Yes, Ron.
There's another analogy I thought of. There's for those movie buffs out there, our family watches a lot of movies. There's a whole series of Avenger movies, and I think the last one was called Infinity War. And 2 of the main characters who were kind of, besides having superpowers, a little odd ducks, one in particular that kind of had a dark side, had kind of fallen in love with one of the ones that probably brought out his better nature. And at the end, the way that it came down is the villain, for a lack of a better term, had constructed a situation where the only way that everyone was going to get out of this is that if one of the 2 of them died. They were both sent on a particular mission, and one of the 2 of them had to die. And he basically sacrificed himself because of how she had changed his life and his love for her. So I wonder sometimes, I do. I think the mind gets a very bad rap from a lot of these guys, and because I think it is a wooing of the mind, and the mind has to get to the point where it is willing to sacrifice itself. And exactly what that looks like, I don't know. Maybe it's the moth to the flame. Maybe it's convinced that is true, but it can't cross that bridge. It can't take you over that bridge. It's got to stay on this side. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, again, that's what the really intense desire for liberation is. It's occurring in the mind. It's making the mind more interested in the self, the true self, the flame, than in the outer things. And Bernadette Roberts talks about that in her way too. She talks about the ego for bad and the ego for good, right? And the ego for bad is the self-centered ego that we've been talking about, which we were using the term evil a while ago. The ego for good is the ego interested in awakening, interested in God, interested in the divine. But it's the ego. And if you think about it, that has to be true, because the true self has never fallen into delusion, right? So how could it seek awakening? It has to be the egoic mind. All right, let's see what we have next to look at here. I have 792 and 793 together. So 792, mature aspirants will willingly and without rebelling. You guys hear that? Mature aspirants will willingly and without rebelling submit themselves to this magnetic power of the grace of self-effulgence. Others, on the other hand, will become extroverted, that is, will turn their attention outwards, fearing the attraction of this power. Therefore, we should first make ourselves fit by the intense love to know the self and by the tremendous detachment of having no desire to attend to any second or third person. And since I just used the moth example, one moth, one of my little imaginary moths has heard that if you fly too close to the flame will burn you up. So that moth makes sure it stays way out here. It never gets too close, But then there's another moth who just has fallen so in love with the beauty of the flame itself that it gets attracted to the flame and it flies right in and is destroyed, right? And that's really, again, we're talking about the mind here. The mind, we've all heard about ego, death, and all that kind of stuff. So the mind can be so afraid of the truth that it makes sure it stays fluttering way out here. It doesn't go near it. Or we can allow ourselves to fall in love with the truth so that we don't care.